Samantha's world had collapsed when her parents fell ill. The once lively home she knew, filled with the hum of daily life, was now a hushed and desolate place, suffocated by the weight of sickness, poverty, and helplessness. She watched as her parents slowly withered away, ravaged by an illness they couldn't afford to treat. It gnawed at their bodies and their spirits, and in those agonizing moments, Samantha felt the crushing burden of being their only hope, the only person who could fix things. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't save them. Her mother, Karen, had been the first to fall ill. It started with a cough which they dismissed as just a cold, but it didn't get better. It only got worse. Her father, Robert, who had always been the strong, dependable man, followed suit. Within 2 months, both of them were bedridden, too weak to do more than murmur to one another. Samantha, now their full-time caretaker, could do little to alleviate their suffering. She scrambled to find help, borrowing money from relatives, calling local health clinics, but nothing seemed to work. Every day the painful realization crept in. Her parents weren't going to make it. On one particularly brutal evening, after another violent fever struck her mother, Samantha made a choice. She dialed her father's younger brother, Uncle Mark. She hadn't seen him in years. He had always been the wealthy, distant relative who lived in the big city, far away from the struggles of their small-town life. But Samantha had no choice. She had to call him. She had to beg for help. "Hello," came his voice, cool and unconcerned, like someone who had no understanding of what real hardship felt like. "Uncle Mark," Samantha's voice trembled. "It's Mum and Dad. They're really sick. We can't afford the hospital. Please, can you help us?" There was a long pause on the other end. Samantha's heart pounded in her chest. "I can, Sam," he replied. His tone was casual, as if he were talking about the weather. "I have my own responsibilities, you know. Things are tough here in New York." Her heart sank. The words she feared had come, and they were worse than she could have imagined. Her uncle had turned his back on them. She had hoped for something, anything, but he offered nothing. She had known deep down that he wouldn't come. His wealth had always come with a price, his indifference to anyone outside his immediate circle. "Please, Uncle Mark," Samantha begged, trying to hide the desperation in her voice. "I'll do anything, just help them. I can't lose them, I need you." The line went silent again, and for a moment she thought he had hung up. Then, after what felt like an eternity, his voice returned. "I'll take you in," he said, his words cold and final, "but you have to leave them. There's nothing I can do for them. They're gone, Samantha. You need to think about your future." The sting of his words was unbearable. She was being told to abandon the people who had given her everything, who had loved her unconditionally. But what choice did she have? Her uncle had money, connections, and the power to offer her a future, even if it meant leaving her parents behind. That night, Samantha sat by her mother's side, her heart heavy with grief. The decision had been made. There was no going back. The next morning, as her parents' final breaths escaped their bodies, Samantha packed her few belongings. She left their home, the place that had once been filled with laughter and love, not knowing if she would ever return. The drive to New York felt endless. Samantha sat in the back of the car, staring out at the passing scenery, her mind consumed by the images of her parents' faces, their last words, and the unbearable guilt that twisted in her chest. She had failed them. She hadn't been able to save them. When they arrived at Uncle Mark's luxurious penthouse, the contrast between her old life and the opulence before her was overwhelming. The building stood tall among the city's skyline, surrounded by sleek glass and metal. It was a world away from the small town she had come from, a world where she felt like an outsider. "Welcome," Uncle Mark greeted her, his voice too warm, too rehearsed. "I'm sure you'll get used to it here." Samantha nodded numbly, her thoughts swirling. The apartment was everything she had imagined and more. Expensive furniture, stunning city views, and a pristine kitchen filled with state-of-the-art appliances. It was beautiful, but it felt empty. There was no warmth, no comfort here, only cold luxury. Uncle Mark led her to a guest room that had been prepared for her. It was spacious, with white linens and a bed large enough to make her feel small. She stared at the room, trying to convince herself that she should be grateful, that she was fortunate to have a safe place to stay. But deep inside, she knew the truth. This place was not home. It never would be. Later that evening, Aunt Susan arrived. She was warm, kind, and welcoming. Her presence was a small comfort amidst the overwhelming emptiness of the apartment. "Come, Samantha," Aunt Susan said with a gentle smile. "Let me show you around. I'm sure you'll like it here. It's a big change, but I think you'll get used to it." Samantha forced a smile. "Thank you, Aunt Susie. I'm sure I will." But deep inside, a sense of dread settled in her chest. This place, with all its luxury, felt more like a prison than a refuge. It wasn't hers, and it never would be. That night, after dinner, Samantha sat in her room, staring out at the glittering lights of the city below. The silence in the room was deafening. Samantha closed her eyes, hoping for sleep, but her mind refused to let her rest. Her thoughts were consumed by guilt, regret, and sadness. She couldn't stop thinking about her parents, how she had failed them, how she couldn't save them. The ache in her chest felt endless, like a weight she couldn't shake. Suddenly there was a knock on the door. "Samantha, are you okay?" Uncle Mark's voice came from the other side of the door. She froze, unsure how to respond. The way he said her name with that false warmth sent a chill down her spine. "I'm fine, Uncle," she replied, her voice strained. "I'm just tired." There was a long pause, and then the door creaked open. Uncle Mark stepped inside, his expression unreadable. He moved to sit on the edge of her bed, too close for comfort. "You don't have to be so formal, Samantha," he said, his tone smooth as though everything was normal. "You're family now. I want you to feel comfortable here." Samantha felt a wave of discomfort wash over her as he sat too close. She shifted uncomfortably, trying to hide her unease. "I'm grateful, Uncle, I really am," she said, forcing a smile, but it lacked any real conviction. Uncle Mark reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. Samantha tensed but didn't pull away. "You're going to be fine here, Samantha. I'll make sure of it," he said, his voice too soft, too intimate. For a moment, Samantha wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. She had come here hoping for safety, but something didn't feel right. The promise of a better life now seemed like a trap, one that she couldn't escape from, but she couldn't leave, not now. "Thank you, Uncle," she whispered, though the words felt hollow. Uncle Mark smiled, though his eyes lingered on her face a moment too long before he stood and left the room, closing the door softly behind him. Samantha lay back on the bed, her heart heavy with dread. She had come to New York hoping for a fresh start, but it felt as though the darkness was just beginning, not ending. The following days passed in a blur of discomfort and uncertainty. Samantha kept herself busy doing small chores around the house, reading books from the shelves in her new room, and avoiding prolonged interaction with Uncle Mark. Every time they crossed paths, a knot tightened in her stomach, and her instincts screamed at her to run. But where could she go? She was trapped, physically in this grand penthouse, and emotionally by the weight of her circumstances. Uncle Mark's gestures of kindness felt more like power plays than genuine care. He would often call her into his study, offering her expensive gifts, luxury perfumes, clothes, and jewelry, and speaking to her in a way that made her feel like a prized possession he was showing off to the world. Sometimes he would sit too close, brushing his hand against hers, or saying something that, while innocent on the surface, made her skin crawl. Samantha tried her best to ignore the growing discomfort she felt in his presence. He was, after all, her uncle, and she was supposed to trust him. But the longer she stayed under his roof, the more she realized that his gestures of kindness had an unsettling undertone. It wasn't long before the weight of his gaze became something she couldn't shake. One evening, after dinner, Samantha was in her room trying to focus on a book she had borrowed from Aunt Susan, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Uncle Mark's unsettling behavior, the way he smiled at her too warmly, the way his eyes lingered a moment too long. A soft knock on the door snapped her from her thoughts. "Samantha, can I come in?" Uncle Mark's voice called out, the false cheerfulness still evident in his tone. She froze. Why was he coming to her room again? She wasn't prepared for another awkward conversation, another moment of his unsettling attention. "I'm fine, Uncle, thank you," she replied, her voice tight. The door creaked open anyway. "I know you're still adjusting," he said, stepping into the room uninvited. "I just wanted to check on you." Samantha stood up quickly, trying to maintain a safe distance. "I'm fine, Uncle, really I am." He didn't seem to take the hint. Instead, he walked toward her a little too confidently, his gaze sweeping across the room before settling on the large bed. "You're still so young, Samantha," he said, sitting down on the edge of the bed. "I know it's been hard losing your parents, but you don't have to be sad anymore. You're with family now. You'll never have to worry about anything again." The way he spoke felt too intimate, like he was sharing a secret. Samantha's heart raced, and she fought the urge to back away, to lock herself in the bathroom, to escape. "I appreciate everything, Uncle Mark," she said, her voice quivering slightly. "But I think I just need some space to adjust." Instead of respecting her request, he leaned forward slightly, his presence too close. "You don't need to be alone, Samantha," he said, his voice low and soft. "You've lost so much. Let me help you." Before she could respond, the sound of footsteps outside the door made them both freeze. "Aunt Susan's calling," came her voice from down the hallway. "Mark, where are you? Dinner's ready." Without another word, Uncle Mark stood up abruptly, smoothing his shirt as if nothing had happened. He smiled at Samantha, but it was forced, a mask hiding something darker underneath. "I'll let you rest," he said, his voice too calm. "We'll talk later." And with that, he was gone. Samantha stood still for a moment, her mind racing. She couldn't understand what was happening, but her gut told her something was very wrong. She had never imagined finding herself in this situation, betrayed by the man who was supposed to protect her. She thought back to the promises he made when she first arrived in New York, how he had assured her she would be safe. Now everything felt hollow, like a cruel joke she had been forced to play along with. That night she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her thoughts spinning. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of Uncle Mark sitting too close, his eyes lingering on her, flashed in her mind. It was like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. She tried to tell herself she was overreacting, that she was just being paranoid, but deep inside she knew something had changed. The moment she stepped into his house, the facade of kindness was beginning to crumble, revealing something far darker underneath. The following days were no better. Uncle Mark's visits to her room became more frequent, always under the guise of checking in or offering her more gifts. Each time, Samantha found herself on edge, her body tensing with fear. She no longer felt like a guest in his home. She felt like a captive, something to be owned, not a niece to be cared for. One afternoon, when Aunt Susan was away, Uncle Mark came to her room again. This time, he didn't even knock before entering. "Samantha," he said, his voice smooth and soft, "I have something for you." He held out a small, expensive-looking box. Samantha looked at it, trying to appear disinterested, but her hands trembled slightly as she took it. Her hand trembled as she held the small box. She wanted to refuse it, wanted to tell her uncle to leave her alone, but deep down she knew she couldn't. No one would believe her. The power he held over her was suffocating, and the fear in her chest seemed to grow with each passing day. She opened the box, and inside was a gold necklace, its pendant catching the light in a way that made her skin crawl. "Uncle, I don't need this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. It felt wrong, all of it. The gift, his presence, the way he watched her like she was some prize to be claimed. "Nonsense," he replied, stepping closer, a cold smile curling on his lips. "You deserve the best, Samantha. I'm only giving you what you deserve." His words hit her like a cold wind. The air between them felt thick with tension, and suddenly she couldn't breathe. The necklace, now in her hands, felt like a heavy weight, a symbol of everything that was wrong. She took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. "I need some time alone," she stammered, her voice barely audible. But Uncle Mark didn't seem to hear her. His hand reached out, fingers brushing her shoulder, and for the first time, Samantha flinched away from him. His expression faltered for a moment, but it quickly hardened, and coldness flickered in his eyes. "Don't push me away, Samantha," he said, his voice no longer warm but demanding. "You'll learn that it's better to accept what's offered to you. I'm trying to help you." Her stomach churned, and the realization hit her like a blow. This wasn't about kindness. He wasn't offering help, he was claiming her, marking her as his possession. The door opened just then, and Aunt Susan's voice floated down the hallway, calling out to Uncle Mark. "Mark, are you still in there?" He pulled away quickly, composing himself in an instant, and a false smile returned to his face. "Just checking on Samantha," he said, his voice casual once more. "I'll be down in a moment." With that, he left, but the tension lingered in the room long after he was gone. Samantha stood frozen, the gold necklace heavy in her hand, her thoughts racing. She had to get out of here, but where could she go? Who could she trust? Most of all, who could save her from the nightmare that had just begun? The days that followed were a blur of unease, each moment stretching longer than the last. Samantha started losing track of time, caught between the grim reality of her situation and the facade of normalcy she tried to maintain. She lived in constant fear of her uncle's next move, never knowing when the next encounter would happen or how far he would push her boundary. The worst part was that she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even when she was alone in her room, it was as if his gaze lingered just outside her door, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. But despite the constant discomfort, she didn't dare speak up. She knew deep down that no one would believe her. Uncle Mark was a well-respected businessman, and she was just a poor, orphaned girl from a small town. Who would listen to her over him? The thought of being cast out into the streets of New York terrified her more than staying under his roof. One evening, just after dinner, Samantha was sitting in the living room when Uncle Mark casually sat beside her on the couch. Aunt Susan was in the kitchen preparing dinner for the following day, leaving the two of them alone. "Samantha," Uncle Mark began, his tone smooth but far too familiar. "You know, you remind me a lot of your mother. She was a beautiful woman, so kind. I used to admire her very much, you know." Samantha stiffened. She didn't want to hear about her mother, not now. Not when it only reminded her of the overwhelming sadness she had buried deep inside. But her uncle wasn't done. "And just like your mother," he continued, his hand resting a little too close to hers, "you have such a special way of drawing people in. I think you're going to be very successful in life, Samantha. I can help you with that, if you let me." His fingers brushed against hers and she recoiled instinctively. Her pulse quickened. She didn't respond. Instead, she stood up abruptly, hoping her actions would send a clear message. "I'm going to my room," she said, her voice shaking slightly, but she tried to sound firm. Uncle Mark didn't move at first, as if debating whether to push her further. After a long moment, he stood up as well. "Of course," he said, his tone shifting back to a neutral, distant one. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay." As he walked out of the room, Samantha felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it didn't last long. Her body was still trembling from the closeness of his touch, the implications of his words, and the unsettling way he had made her feel. She locked her door as soon as she stepped inside, pressing her back against it as if to keep the memories of what had just happened from flooding back. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Her mind raced, unable to settle, haunted by the fear of what would come next. She tried to convince herself she was overreacting, that maybe she was just being paranoid, but deep down she knew better. Uncle Mark had crossed a line and she was trapped in a house with nowhere to run, no one to turn to. The next few weeks were a blur of strained interactions, each more suffocating than the last. Samantha spent her days locked away in her room, doing anything she could to stay busy, studying, reading, even cleaning, though it was rarely needed. She avoided Uncle Mark as much as possible, but his presence lingered in the house like a shadow, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. One afternoon, Samantha was sitting by the window, trying to catch a glimpse of the outside world, when the sound of footsteps outside her door made her freeze. She knew it was Uncle Mark before he even knocked. "Samantha, I've brought you something," he called through the door, his voice laced with something she couldn't quite place. Against her better judgment, she opened the door. Uncle Mark stood there, holding a small, expensive-looking box. "For you," he said, his voice soft, almost coaxing. "It's a special gift. I thought it might brighten your day." Samantha stared at the box in his hands. A cold pit formed in her stomach. She wanted to refuse. She wanted to tell him to leave her alone, but she knew she couldn't, not without consequences. She forced a smile and took the box from him. "Thank you, Uncle," she whispered. He smiled back, but this time it was different. There was something dark in his eyes, something possessive. "You're welcome, Samantha. I only want the best for you." Samantha didn't know how to respond. She just stood there, frozen, clutching the box in her hands. She wanted to scream, to tell him to leave, but she couldn't. The power he had over her was suffocating. She felt small, insignificant, a prisoner in her own home. As soon as he left, Samantha sat on her bed and opened the box. Inside was a beautiful gold bracelet, simple yet elegant, but it wasn't just the bracelet that caught her attention. Tucked underneath it was a note, written in Uncle Mark's neat, precise handwriting. "I will take care of you, Samantha, but you must learn to accept my help in all things." Her hands shook as she read the words. There was no mistaking it now. Uncle Mark wasn't offering kindness. He was asserting control, marking her as his own. She was nothing more than an object to him, something to be kept, something to be controlled. That night, after Aunt Susan had gone to bed, Samantha couldn't stay silent anymore. She couldn't pretend that things were fine. She went to the bathroom and stared at her reflection in the mirror, wondering how she had gotten here, wondering why she hadn't left yet. Her mind screamed at her to escape, but her heart was paralyzed with fear. What would happen if she did? What if Uncle Mark had the power to destroy her, to turn everyone against her? The thought made her sick. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't hide forever. "Samantha?" Uncle Mark's voice came from the other side. "I'm sorry to disturb you. I just wanted to check on you. Make sure you're all right." Samantha didn't respond. She couldn't trust herself to speak. If she opened the door, what would happen next? What would he do to her? She knew what he was capable of, and she knew that she couldn't keep pretending things would get better. They wouldn't. Her mind raced as she backed away from the door, panic rising in her chest. She couldn't face him again. She couldn't allow him to take away whatever little dignity she had left. The door creaked open slightly, and Samantha stepped back in shock. She hadn't locked it. Uncle Mark stepped inside without waiting for her response. "Samantha," he began, his voice too soft, too knowing. "You don't have to hide from me. I'm just trying to help." His words felt like poison, each syllable laced with an underlying threat. He took a step closer, and Samantha's instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. It felt as though her entire body was betraying her. "You've been through so much," he said, his eyes studying her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "And I understand. Really, I do. But you need to trust me, Samantha. I'm your family. I've been nothing but kind to you since you came here. I only want to take care of you." His smile was all teeth, his voice too smooth, too insistent. Samantha felt sick to her stomach. Every part of her screamed at her to leave, to get away from him, but she couldn't move. "You've been through so much pain," Uncle Mark repeated, reaching for her arm gently, as if he were comforting her. "And I'm here for you. I'm the only one who's ever been here for you." For a moment, the world around Samantha seemed to slow down. She couldn't breathe. His hand on her arm was the final straw. His touch, once so familiar, now felt like a dark, suffocating chain. A flash of the past swirled in her mind, the gentle, loving hands of her father, her mother's warm embrace. But now all she could feel was Uncle Mark's cold grip on her life, on her future. She didn't know what to do, but one thing was clear: she had to get out of this room. She had to escape. "I'm tired," Samantha stammered, barely able to control the shaking in her voice. "Please, Uncle, I just want to be left alone." Uncle Mark's eyes narrowed slightly, as though the sweetness in his voice was just a mask that was beginning to slip. "I'm only trying to help you," he said again, his voice lowering. "But you need to stop fighting me, Samantha. I'm the one who's here for you now. You need to trust me." Samantha recoiled, pulling her arm away from his grasp. She backed away toward the door, but before she could reach it, Uncle Mark's hand shot out, grabbing her by the wrist, stopping her cold. "You can't run from this, Samantha," he said, his voice growing dark, his grip tightening on her wrist. Samantha's breath caught in her throat, panic rising in her chest. She couldn't take this anymore. The man who had promised to care for her, to provide for her, was now the source of her deepest fear. He wasn't family. He wasn't someone who cared for her. He was a monster, hiding behind a mask of kindness. "Please," Samantha whispered, her voice breaking, "please let me go." But instead of releasing her, Uncle Mark pulled her closer, his grip unrelenting. "You're so much like her," he murmured, almost to himself, as if studying her. "Your mother? She never knew how to accept help. She pushed me away too. But not you, Samantha. You'll learn to trust me. Just like she should have." Samantha's mind spun. Her uncle wasn't just threatening her physically, he was toying with her emotions, using her love for her parents against her. She didn't know how to escape from his grasp, from his power over her. All she could do was look into his eyes, searching for any trace of the man who had once promised to help her, to care for her. But there was nothing, just coldness, just control. A faint sound from the hallway suddenly broke through her fog of fear. The distant sound of Aunt Susan's voice calling for Uncle Mark. It was enough to snap Samantha out of her trance. She acted on instinct, jerking her wrist free from his grasp with all the strength she could muster. Uncle Mark didn't stop her this time. Instead, he let her go, watching her with cold eyes as she stumbled backward toward the door. "I'll let you be for now, Samantha," he said, his voice returning to that false sweetness. "But don't think I won't be back. You're mine now, and you'll understand that eventually." Samantha didn't say anything. She didn't even look at him again. With all the strength she had left, she fled the room, slamming the door behind her. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breathing ragged as she pressed her back against the door, trying to steady herself. It was then that Samantha realized how deeply she had fallen into his trap. She had nothing left, no family to turn to, no one who would believe her. She was alone in this city, trapped in a house with a man who had vowed to take her in and protect her. And yet he was the one who had destroyed her sense of safety. But one thing was clear: she could no longer hide. She had to fight. She had to escape. The days that followed were even worse. Uncle Mark's actions became bolder, more aggressive. He would come into her room at night, pretending to check on her, but his presence was always a constant reminder of her fear. Samantha spent her days trying to avoid him, but the walls of the mansion seemed to close in around her. With every passing day, she was no longer a guest. She was a prisoner, trapped by promises that had turned into lies. The constant tension weighed heavily on her. Every step she took felt like it was being watched. Every decision she made seemed to have consequences, and every day the feeling of being completely alone in the world became harder to bear. Samantha's fear slowly gave way to a quiet resolve. She couldn't continue living like this. She had to fight back, no matter the cost. One evening, after Aunt Susan had gone to bed, Samantha made up her mind. She had to leave. There had to be a way out. She could not, no, she would not allow herself to be broken like her mother had been. This wasn't just about escaping her uncle. It was about saving herself from the life that had been forced upon her. She packed a small bag with her few belongings, her heart pounding in her chest as she stole glances at the door. She had no plan, no real idea of where she would go, but she had to try. She couldn't live in fear anymore. As she tiptoed toward the door, a voice called out from the hallway. "Samantha." She froze. Uncle Mark's voice was smooth and low, like a predator circling its prey. "I thought we were past this," he said. "You can't run from me. I'll always find you." Samantha's heart sank. He knew. He always knew. Her chest tightened, and for a moment time seemed to slow. Uncle Mark's voice sent a wave of dread through her, and she knew with cold certainty that he was right. He always knew. Quickly, she shoved the bag under her bed and turned toward the door, pretending she hadn't been preparing to leave. She stood still, trying to steady her breath, her heart racing. Uncle Mark's footsteps approached slowly, and she could hear the faint rustling of fabric as he leaned against the doorframe. "Samantha," he called again, his voice calm but insistent. "You know I care for you. You don't have to be afraid." Samantha didn't speak. Her throat was tight, her mind reeling. The walls of the room felt like they were closing in, pressing against her with every passing second. She couldn't breathe. "I'm here for you," he continued, his tone smooth, almost coaxing. "You'll come to understand that all I'm offering is love. Samantha, you deserve to be loved." His words felt like a slap to her face. How could he say such things when he was the one suffocating her, controlling her every movement, turning her into something she wasn't? He was the one who had broken every piece of trust she had left. His so-called love was nothing more than manipulation, a game of control. She had to escape. There was no other choice. Samantha turned toward the door, her eyes meeting his. He stood there, blocking her way, a smug, knowing expression on his face. His eyes glinted with dark satisfaction, as if he could read her every thought. "You can't leave, Samantha," he said, his voice low and warning. "You're not ready to face the world out there. You don't know what it's like. You don't know who to trust." "I have nothing left here," Samantha spat back, her voice shaking but determined. "You're not my family. You're just a monster hiding behind a mask." Uncle Mark's eyes narrowed for a moment. His smile faltered, revealing a glimpse of the cold man he truly was. But it was gone just as quickly as it came, replaced by the polished, controlling figure he had been since the moment she stepped into his home. "You don't understand what you're saying," he replied, his voice calm and almost patient. "You've been through too much. I'm the only one who can protect you, Samantha. No one else can." But Samantha wasn't listening anymore. She couldn't. She was done with this game. She had heard enough. She had made up her mind. "I won't be your prisoner anymore," she said, her voice stronger now, though it still trembled with fear. "I'm leaving, and there's nothing you can do to stop me." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with finality. For a brief moment, Uncle Mark looked at her in silence, and then something in his eyes shifted, darkened. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice like gravel. "No one will believe you. No one will care. You'll be alone. You think you're free, but you're not." Samantha didn't respond. She couldn't afford to waste another second in this house. She couldn't listen to him anymore. The fear was still there, but now there was something else, something stronger, fiercer. She had to leave. She had to escape this nightmare. Before Uncle Mark could react, she darted past him. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she barely registered the sound of his voice shouting behind her. She ran as fast as she could down the hallway, through the house until she reached the back door. It was locked. Samantha cursed under her breath. She turned toward the front door, but she could already hear the sounds of footsteps, muffled voices. Uncle Mark had gone to get help. She didn't have much time. Desperation flooded her veins as she ran toward the kitchen. Her heart was in her throat now. The door, the exit, the only thing standing between her and freedom. She had to make it. She had to. Her hand shook as she grabbed a nearby chair and smashed it against the kitchen window. The sound of breaking glass sent a wave of panic through her. She crawled through the shards of glass, ignoring the sting of the cuts on her skin. She couldn't afford to stop, to hesitate. She had to get out. The cold night air hit her skin as she tumbled out of the house, gasping for breath. The mansion loomed behind her, dark and silent now. She could hear the voices of the guards in the distance, but they weren't close enough. She ran. She ran with everything she had left. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but she didn't care. She couldn't stop. Every step was a victory. Every moment she spent away from that house was a breath of freedom. But freedom didn't come without a cost. She knew Uncle Mark wouldn't let her go easily. He would come after her. He would send people. He would hunt her down. Samantha didn't know where she was going, but she couldn't stay in the streets. She needed help. She needed someone who could protect her, someone who could understand. As she ran through the darkened streets of New York, her thoughts turned to the one person she could trust, Aunt Susan, the woman who had once shown her kindness, the only one who seemed to understand her pain. She didn't know if Susan would help her, but at that moment, it was the only hope she had left. Samantha's mind raced as she pushed through the streets, trying to stay hidden. She couldn't go back. She couldn't let Uncle Mark find her again. The fear of what he might do, the control he still had over her, gnawed at her every step. But she had made it this far. She was alive. She had a chance, and she wasn't going to let him take it from her. As the hours passed, Samantha found herself standing in front of Aunt Susan's small apartment. Her breath came in short gasps. She knocked softly at first, hesitating, unsure of what to expect. It was late, and she wasn't sure if anyone would be awake. Then the door creaked open, and Susan's face appeared, framed in the dim light from inside. When she saw Samantha, her expression changed instantly. Shock, concern, and a deep understanding in her eyes. "Samantha," Susan whispered, stepping back to let her in. "What are you doing here? It's so late." "I had to leave," Samantha said, her voice breaking. "I had to get away." Susan took one look at her, her eyes scanning her face for any sign of injury, of distress. She quickly pulled Samantha inside, locking the door behind her. "Tell me everything," Susan urged gently. "You're safe here. You're not alone anymore." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Samantha felt a flicker of hope in her chest. Samantha felt safe, at least for now, but the road ahead was uncertain. Uncle Mark would not let her go easily, and she knew the battle for her freedom was far from over. But at least now she had a chance to fight back. The apartment was small, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Samantha allowed herself to breathe. Aunt Susan had quickly ushered her inside, locking the door behind them to ensure they were safe, for the moment. Samantha's eyes scanned the room. There was a worn-out couch, a small kitchen with faded cupboards, and a single bed in the corner. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that she was away from Uncle Mark, away from the mansion that had become her prison. Susan led her to the couch and gently urged her to sit. "You're safe here, Samantha. No one's going to hurt you," Susan said softly, her voice reassuring. But Samantha could feel the weight of her emotions rising. She had been holding everything in for so long, grief, fear, pain. And now, in this small room with Susan, the walls seemed to close in. "I didn't know where else to go," Samantha whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't think I could keep going. He's been controlling me." Susan sat beside her, her hand gently resting on Samantha's shoulder in a comforting gesture. I know," Susan said softly. "But you're here now. You're safe." Tears welled up in Samantha's eyes, and she tried to wipe them away, but they just kept coming. The floodgates had opened, and there was no stopping them. She couldn't hold it in anymore. "I'm scared, Susan," Samantha sobbed, her shoulders shaking. "I don't know what to do. He'll come for me. He won't let me go." Susan's face softened with empathy, and she pulled Samantha into an embrace, holding her tightly. "You don't have to be scared anymore. I'll help you. We'll figure this out together." Samantha clung to her, grateful for the warmth and support, but still filled with a gnawing fear deep inside her. She knew that Uncle Mark wouldn't stop. He couldn't. He had already shown her how far he was willing to go to maintain control over her. And now she was out of his reach, but she had no illusions. He would come for her. He would try to force her back into his life. The hours passed slowly, and Samantha tried to calm down, her heart still racing. Susan made tea and sat with her in silence, offering comfort without speaking too much. Eventually, Samantha's tears subsided, but the exhaustion was still there. She hadn't slept in days, hadn't allowed herself to rest, fearing that she might not wake up in the same place. Susan didn't push her to talk more than she was ready, but she made it clear that Samantha wasn't alone. She was here for her and she would help her figure out what to do next. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" Susan asked gently, breaking the silence. Samantha hesitated for a moment. She wasn't sure if she could put everything into words, if she could explain the twisted, suffocating reality of her life with Uncle Mark. But she knew she couldn't keep running from the truth. She had to speak it out loud. "I don't know when it started," Samantha said softly, her voice trembling. "He was always kind to me at first, or I thought he was. But then he started acting differently. He'd say things, make comments. He'd get too close. And I couldn't say anything, Susan. I didn't know what to do. And then, when he crossed the line, it was like I couldn't breathe anymore. Every day, it was like he was taking more from me." She stopped, the words choking her throat. Her whole body trembled as she tried to control the emotions that were threatening to overtake her again. "Samantha, you did nothing wrong," Susan said firmly, her voice filled with compassion and strength. "He's the one who's wrong. You're not to blame for his actions. You didn't deserve any of this." Samantha nodded, trying to hold back more tears, but the weight of her guilt and shame still clung to her. How had she let this happen? How had she allowed herself to be so trapped, so powerless? As the night stretched on, Samantha finally drifted into a restless sleep on the couch. But even in sleep, she couldn't escape the nightmares that plagued her. She dreamt of Uncle Mark's face, his cold eyes, his grip on her wrist, his promises that she would never escape. She dreamed of running, of trying to get away, only for him to always find her, always pull her back into the dark place she had fought so hard to leave. She woke in the middle of the night, gasping for air, her heart pounding. She looked around the dimly lit room, disoriented, and it took her a moment to remember where she was, but the fear still gripped her. Susan stirred in the chair next to her, waking at the sound of Samantha's sharp intake of breath. She sat up, concern in her eyes. "It's okay, Samantha," Susan whispered. "It's okay. You're safe here." But Samantha didn't feel safe, not really. Not while the threat of Uncle Mark loomed over her. He would come for her, she knew that. She couldn't stay here forever, hiding in the shadows, waiting for him to find her. She had to act. The next morning, Samantha woke early, the weight of her decision heavy on her shoulders. She couldn't stay in hiding. She needed to take control of her life again, to make sure that Uncle Mark could never hurt her again. She had to fight back, but she didn't know how. She didn't know where to turn or who could help her. But she couldn't sit still anymore. She had already spent too many days cowering in fear. The pain of what had happened was still raw, but it had also sparked something in her, a determination she hadn't felt before. She wasn't going to let him control her anymore. "Susan," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "I need to do something. I can't keep running." Susan looked at her with understanding. "You're not alone, Samantha. We'll figure this out, but you can't do it alone. We need to get help. There are people who will believe you, people who can protect you." Samantha nodded, her eyes hardening with resolve. "I want to go to the police," she said, her voice steady despite the fear rising in her chest. "I'm not going to be quiet anymore. I'm not going to let him do this to anyone else." Susan's eyes widened in surprise, but she nodded, her expression one of fierce support. "You're brave, Samantha. I'll go with you. We'll make sure they listen." Samantha wasn't sure what would happen after she went to the police. She didn't know if they would believe her or if Uncle Mark's power would protect him, but she had to try. She couldn't keep living in fear. She had to speak out for herself and for everyone else he had hurt. She was done being his victim. The morning light filtered through the small window, casting a soft glow over the modest apartment. Samantha sat on the edge of the couch, her mind racing. Today she was going to take the first step toward reclaiming her life. She had made up her mind. No more running, no more hiding. She had to confront the nightmare she had been living through and fight for her future. Susan sat beside her, offering quiet encouragement, but Samantha could see the concern in her eyes. This was a dangerous step. No one knew how far Uncle Mark would go to protect himself, how much power he had at his disposal. But Samantha couldn't be afraid anymore. Samantha's stomach churned at the thought of facing Uncle Mark again. But it was the only way forward. She couldn't keep hiding forever. "You ready?" Susan asked gently, her voice full of care but also with the weight of understanding. Samantha nodded, though her heart pounded in her chest. She had never felt more unsure, more terrified, but there was no turning back now. She couldn't spend another moment locked in fear, trapped in the house that had once promised her safety, but had instead become her prison. "I don't know if I am," Samantha replied, her voice shaky but resolute. "But I don't have a choice. I have to do this." Susan stood and moved to the door, giving Samantha one last reassuring look. "We'll go together. You're not alone in this." Samantha stood up slowly, her legs weak beneath her, but with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in weeks. She took a deep breath and followed Susan out of the apartment. The ride to the police station felt like an eternity. Each minute dragged on, and Samantha's mind spun with doubt. What if they didn't believe her? What if Uncle Mark's connections were too strong? What if she was just another girl with a broken story that no one cared to listen to? The self-doubt gnawed at her, but she pushed it aside. She had already been silenced for too long. It was time to speak the truth. When they arrived, Susan guided her through the gates and into the building. The station was bustling with officers moving in and out, handling cases, answering calls, dealing with the problems of the city. Samantha's nerves shot up again as they walked through the hallway. Everything felt so foreign to her, so official. She felt like she didn't belong here. But that was exactly why she needed to be here. Susan spoke to one of the officers at the front desk, explaining that Samantha needed to report something. After a few minutes, they were escorted into a small, dimly lit room. Samantha sat down at the table, hands clenched in her lap, her heart racing. She could hear her own pulse in her ears, a rhythmic pounding that matched the pace of her thoughts. The door opened, and a tall, stern-looking officer stepped in. He introduced himself as Officer Iena. His voice was calm but professional. He asked Samantha to explain why she was there. She had been preparing herself for this moment, rehearsing the words in her mind countless times, trying to find the right way to tell her story, to make them believe her. She looked at Susan, who gave her an encouraging nod, and then Samantha began. "I've been living with my uncle since my parents died," she started, her voice trembling slightly at first. "He said he'd take care of me. He promised he would help me get back on my feet. But then things changed. He started treating me differently. He started making advances, saying things to me, touching me in ways that made me uncomfortable, and it got worse. He did things to me. Things I can't even describe." Tears filled Samantha's eyes, and she tried to wipe them away, but they just kept coming. The floodgates had opened, and there was no stopping them. The weight of the truth had been unbearable, but now that it was out, she felt a strange sense of release, as if she had finally broken free from the chains that had held her in silence for so long. Officer Iena listened intently, his face impassive, but Samantha could see the glimmer of understanding in his eyes. He took notes as she spoke, asking her to clarify certain details, to explain how long this had been going on and what had happened. She told him everything. The gifts, the promises, the manipulations, the abuse. She left nothing out. When she finished, the silence in the room seemed to press down on her, heavy and thick. She looked up at Officer Iena, her chest tight with anxiety. "Do you believe me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Officer Iena leaned back in his chair, his eyes softening for a moment. "We take accusations like this very seriously, Samantha," he said quietly. "We have to investigate this, but you've done the right thing. You've come forward, and that takes a lot of courage." Samantha let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to feel something. Hope. The process would be long, difficult, and filled with challenges, but she wasn't alone anymore. She had taken the first step, and that was enough for now. After the interview, Samantha and Susan were escorted out of the station. The investigation would take time, and they would need to come back for further questioning. Samantha felt drained, as if every ounce of energy had been sucked out of her, but she couldn't stop now. There was too much at stake. Her uncle would fight back, he would deny everything, he would use his money, his influence. But Samantha knew she had to stay strong. She couldn't let him win, she couldn't let him silence her again. As they stepped outside the station, Susan turned to Samantha, her expression full of both pride and concern. "You did it," Susan said, her voice full of admiration. "You've taken the first step toward freedom, and we'll get through this together." Samantha nodded, but the fear still lingered deep within her. Uncle Mark was powerful. He could try to twist things, use his wealth to manipulate the situation. But Samantha was no longer afraid to face him. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to back down now. She glanced at Susan, who gave her a warm smile of encouragement. "We'll make sure he doesn't get away with it," Susan said, her voice full of resolve. Samantha's eyes were focused, determined. The road ahead would be tough, filled with obstacles and doubt, but she was ready for it. The truth had been set free, and now it was time for the world to know what had happened. She would fight for justice, and in doing so, she would reclaim her life. The days following Samantha's visit to the police station felt like a blur. Each moment stretched on endlessly as she waited for the investigation to take shape. She couldn't shake the fear that Uncle Mark would find a way to erase everything she had said, to make it all disappear. But deep down, she knew she had done the right thing. She had spoken up. And for the first time in months, she could breathe a little easier. The police had promised they would launch an investigation, but Samantha knew how these things worked. Her uncle's wealth and influence could make this difficult, if not impossible. She spent most of her time with Susan, who remained a steady source of support, offering her a place to stay, comforting her, and helping her navigate the uncertainty that followed. One morning, a week later, Samantha was sitting at the kitchen table, trying to distract herself with a book, though her mind was elsewhere. Every time the phone rang or the doorbell chimed, her heart skipped a beat, wondering if it was the police calling her back for further questioning. Or worse, if it was a call from Uncle Mark or his lawyer. Susan entered the room, her face serious, her expression tight with worry. "Samantha, there's someone here to see you," she said quietly, her voice holding a note of concern. Samantha's heart dropped. She had been expecting this moment, Uncle Mark or one of his associates coming to silence her, intimidate her into withdrawing her statement. It was happening faster than she had anticipated. "Who is it?" Samantha asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Susan replied, "but he says he's from the police." Samantha's stomach turned. This was it. Either an ally or someone sent by Uncle Mark to intimidate her. She took a deep breath and nodded. "I'll speak with him." When Samantha entered the small living room, she was greeted by a tall man in his 40s, dressed in a plain navy blue suit. His expression was calm but firm, and there was an air of professionalism about him that put Samantha slightly at ease. "Samantha?" he asked, his voice gentle yet authoritative. "Yes," she replied, her hands nervously clutching the hem of her shirt. "I'm Detective Ayanam, leading the investigation into the accusations against your uncle," he explained, his tone steady. "We've made some progress, and I need to ask you a few more questions." Samantha nodded, her breath catching in her throat. She had been expecting a confrontation, but not this. A real investigation with someone who was listening to her. She sat down, her mind still spinning, but she focused on the detective, ready to speak. "We've spoken to a few people in your uncle's circle, and we've gathered some important evidence," Detective Ayana continued. "There are a few inconsistencies in his story that we're trying to resolve. It's going to take time, but you need to know, we're not going to let this slide. If he's guilty, he'll be held accountable." The words hit Samantha like a weight lifting off her chest. For the first time in a long while, she felt like there was a glimmer of hope. a possibility that her uncle's lies and abuse would be exposed. She had been so afraid that her voice would be lost, that no one would believe her. But now, the investigation was moving forward. "I've never been more scared in my life," Samantha confessed, her voice shaking. "I don't know if he'll stop. He has connections, power. I don't know if I'll ever be safe." Detective Iena gave her a reassuring nod. "I understand your fear, but we're doing everything we can to make sure you're protected." Samantha felt the weight of her decision, but this time it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like strength. The thought of facing Uncle Mark again made her stomach churn, but it was the only way forward. She couldn't keep running. She couldn't stay trapped in fear, stuck in a life that had become a prison. "You're not alone in this," Susan said as she stood, offering Samantha one last reassuring look. "We'll go together." Samantha nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She was terrified, but she couldn't back down now. She had already taken the hardest step. She had spoken the truth, and that meant she was no longer bound by silence. The ride to the police station was long, each minute stretching like hours. Samantha's thoughts raced. What if they didn't believe her? What if Uncle Mark used his wealth and influence to get away with it? What if all of this was for nothing? The doubts gnawed at her, but she forced herself to push them aside. She had already been silenced for too long. It was time to speak her truth. When they arrived, Susan guided her through the gates of the station and into the building. The atmosphere inside was thick with tension, the sound of ringing phones and hurried footsteps. It felt foreign to Samantha, too official, too far removed from the world she had known. But it was exactly where she needed to be. Susan spoke to the officer at the front desk, explaining why they were there. A few minutes later, they were led into a small, dimly lit room. Samantha sat down at the table, her hands trembling in her lap, her heart racing. She could feel the pounding of her pulse in her ears. The door opened, and Detective Iena stepped in. He introduced himself with a calm, professional tone, though his eyes conveyed empathy. He asked Samantha to explain why she was there. Samantha had rehearsed this moment in her mind so many times. She had prepared herself for the weight of speaking the truth, but as she began, her voice quivered. "I've been living with my uncle since my parents died," Samantha began, her voice trembling. "He promised to take care of me, but then things started to change. He started making advances, saying things to me, touching me in ways that made me uncomfortable. And it kept getting worse. He did things to me, things I can't even explain." Tears welled up in her eyes as she spoke. It felt like a release, but also a weight she hadn't expected to bear. The truth had been locked inside her for so long, and now that it was out, it was hard to breathe. Detective Iena listened attentively, taking notes and asking for clarification as she spoke. Samantha detailed everything. His promises, the gift, the way everything had started out so subtly before turning into control, manipulation, and abuse. She told him everything she could remember, from the first signs to the escalating behavior that had left her feeling trapped. When she finished, the silence in the room seemed to press down on her. She looked at Detective Iena, her chest tight with anxiety. "Do you believe me?" she whispered. Detective Iena leaned back in his chair, his expression softening. "We take accusations like this very seriously, Samantha. We have to investigate thoroughly. But you've done the right thing by coming forward. It takes a lot of courage, and you're not alone in this." Samantha let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. For the first time in so long, she allowed herself to feel something close to hope. The process was going to take time, and there would be obstacles, she knew that. But for now, she wasn't alone. For the first time, she felt like her voice mattered. After the questioning, Susan and Samantha were escorted out of the station. Samantha felt drained, like every ounce of energy had been sapped from her. But she knew she couldn't stop now. There was still too much at stake. Uncle Mark would fight back. He would deny everything. He would use his power, his influence, and she had no illusions about how far he might go. But she couldn't let him win. She couldn't let him silence her again. As they stepped outside, Susan turned to her face a mixture of pride and concern. "You did it," Susan said. "You've taken the first step toward freedom. We'll get through this together." Samantha nodded, but fear still lingered deep inside her. Uncle Mark was powerful. He would do everything he could to twist the situation, to use his money and connections to manipulate things. But Samantha wasn't afraid anymore. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to back down now. "We'll make sure he doesn't get away with it," Susan added, her voice steady. Samantha felt a surge of determination. The road ahead would be tough, there would be more obstacles, more fears to face, but she was ready. She had spoken the truth, and now it was time for the world to hear it. The next few days felt like a blur. Samantha spent most of her time in Susan's apartment, trying to keep her mind occupied. Every ring of the phone or chime of the doorbell made her heart race, wondering if it was the police calling her back in, or worse, if it was Uncle Mark or his lawyer. But then, one afternoon, as Samantha sat at the kitchen table trying to read a book, her phone rang. The caller ID said Detective Iena. Her heart skipped a beat. "Hello," Samantha answered quickly. "Samantha." Detective Iena's calm but urgent voice came through the line. "We've gathered enough evidence to bring your uncle in for questioning. We need you to come to the station. This is the next step in making sure he's held accountable." Samantha's breath caught in her throat. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. She looked up at Susan, who had entered the room, sensing something was wrong. "Detective Iena," Samantha said shakily. "They're bringing him in. I need to go." Susan rushed to her side, her face full of concern, but also pride. "You're doing the right thing, Samantha. You've come so far. I'm proud of you." Samantha nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She wasn't sure if this was the final step in her fight for justice, but she knew it was a crucial one. With Susan by her side, she gathered her things and followed the detective's instructions to the police station. At the station, the tension was palpable. Samantha sat in the waiting room, her heart pounding. She had already gone over everything in her mind. The details of what had happened, the times, the threats, the way Uncle Mark had manipulated and controlled her. But now it felt even more real, knowing that he was about to be confronted with the truth. Detective Iena came out of the interrogation room, his expression serious. "We've started the questioning," he said. "Your uncle is being difficult, but we have the evidence we need. We're filing charges against him today." Samantha's breath caught. This was it. It was happening. "You're not alone," Detective Iena continued. "We've got your back, and we'll make sure he's held accountable for everything he's done." The rest of the day blurred together as Samantha waited for updates. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly, but as the sun began to set, Detective Iena returned with the news she had been waiting for. "We've arrested him," the detective said, his voice firm but with a note of relief. "We have enough to charge him. He's not going anywhere." Samantha's eyes filled with disbelief and relief. For so long, she had been consumed by fear, convinced that Uncle Mark would escape justice, but now he was facing the consequences of his actions. He couldn't hurt her anymore. Her fight wasn't over. The road to justice was long, and there would still be obstacles ahead, but for the first time in a long while, Samantha felt peace. She had taken the power back from the man who had tried to control her. As she left the police station that evening, her head held high, she knew that her journey had only just begun. The road to healing would be long, but now she could walk it with her head held high, no longer trapped by fear. She was free. Samantha sat in Susan's apartment, looking out at the bustling streets of Lagos. She thought about how far she had come. It had been a long, painful road, but she was finally taking control of her life. She was no longer the frightened girl locked away in her uncle's house. She was stronger now. She was a survivor. And nothing, not even Uncle Mark's influence, could take that from her. The days following Samantha's follow-up statement were filled with tense silence, broken only by brief check-ins from Detective Iena. The investigation was moving forward, but at a pace that felt agonizingly slow. The walls of Susan's small apartment felt even smaller as time dragged on. Despite the support from her friend, the fear of the unknown continued to gnaw at her. Samantha knew Uncle Mark had the resources to drag things out. He had money, connections, and the kind of power that could make her story seem insignificant. She had heard of wealthy men using their influence to escape justice, bending the system until it broke. And as much as she wanted to believe that the truth would win, a small, constant voice in her mind told her that her uncle might still find a way to escape. Her thoughts were interrupted one afternoon when Detective Iena called. She sat up quickly, her heart rate quickening. "Samantha," the detective's voice came through the line, calm but urgent. "We've filed the charges, we've gathered all the necessary evidence, but your uncle's lawyer is pulling every trick to discredit you. They're claiming it's a case of misunderstanding, that your statement isn't credible." Samantha's stomach sank. She had been expecting this, but hearing it from the detective made it all the more real. Uncle Mark wasn't just going to let this go. He was going to fight with everything he had. "Is there anything I can do?" Samantha asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "We'll be calling you in for the trial soon," Detective Iena replied. "We need you to stay strong. This is the most crucial part of the process. The more consistent you are with your story, the harder it will be for his defense to tear it down. We've also made arrangements for your protection. Don't worry, Samantha. We're moving forward." Samantha nodded, though she felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She couldn't stop thinking about the trial. The thought of facing Uncle Mark again, in front of a courtroom full of people, made her skin crawl. She had already lived through so much of his control, his manipulation. The thought of his lawyer turning her words into a twisted narrative sent a shiver down her spine. But she knew she couldn't back down. She had come this far, she couldn't let him win. For herself, for her parents, and for everyone else who had suffered at his hands. The next few days were filled with preparations for the trial. Detective Iena and a prosecutor, a woman named Michelle Ojo, met with Samantha to go over her statement again. They reminded her of the importance of staying calm and focused. They gave her advice on what to expect in the courtroom, what kinds of questions the defense might ask, and how to respond. Samantha's anxiety only increased with each conversation. The thought of being cross-examined by a lawyer who would try to tear apart her truth made her feel small and powerless again. She remembered the fear she had felt living under Uncle Mark's roof, the way he had turned everything she said into something else, how he had made her doubt herself. But this time it was different. This time she was in control of her own story. She had made the decision to speak out, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that from her. Susan was her constant source of comfort, staying by her side every step of the way. She held Samantha's hand as they walked into the courthouse, her presence a quiet reminder that she wasn't alone. "Remember, you're stronger than you think," Susan whispered as they stood in the crowded hallway outside the courtroom. "You're not the scared girl anymore. You've already won so much by getting this far." Samantha nodded, trying to take comfort in her words. She wasn't sure if she was ready to face what lay ahead, but she knew she had no other choice. The truth had to be heard. Inside the courtroom, Samantha's heart raced. The walls felt too close, the air too thick. She sat in the witness box, staring at the jury, trying to keep her hands from shaking. The prosecution had called her in first to testify about her experience living with Uncle Mark. The defense was waiting, ready to dismantle her testimony. Samantha took a deep breath, steadying herself. She focused on Prosecutor Michelle Ojo, who stood beside her, offering a reassuring smile. "Samantha, I know this is hard," Michelle said softly, "but just tell the truth. They can't take that from you." Samantha nodded, her throat tight. She hadn't thought about her uncle in months, not in the way she had to think about him now. She had to look him in the eye. She had to call him out for what he had done. The thought made her nauseous. When the defense attorney, a tall, sharp-featured man, rose, Samantha felt a cold sweat form on her brow. He started by questioning the details of her story, probing for inconsistencies. He asked her about the gifts her uncle had given her, trying to twist them into something innocent. He even suggested that she had misunderstood his behavior, that he had only been trying to help her adjust to a new life. "You've made some very serious accusations, Samantha," Mr. Nungo said, his voice smooth like a snake. "But where's the proof? You have no physical evidence, no witnesses to back up your claims. All we have is your word against his." Samantha's heart raced as he continued to question her. The words were like daggers, each one cutting at her confidence, at the strength she had worked so hard to build. She wanted to break down, to flee the room, but she couldn't. She had to stand her ground. For her parents, for herself. "Mr. Nango, I don't need physical evidence to prove what happened," Samantha said, her voice shaking but determined. "I have my truth, and that's all I need." Mr. Nango smirked, clearly hoping to break her, but Samantha didn't look away. She held her ground, telling her story with every ounce of strength she had left. "I know what he did to me, and I know I'm not the only one he's hurt." The words echoed in the courtroom. For the first time, Samantha felt like the power was shifting. The weight of her truth hung in the air, undimmed. The trial lasted for days, with each side presenting their arguments. It was a long, exhausting process, but as the days went on, Samantha began to feel a sense of resolve settling in. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a witness, a fighter. She was speaking out for all the people who had been silenced by people like her uncle. And then, after what felt like an eternity, the final day arrived. The jury had deliberated, and the time had come for the verdict. Samantha sat in the courtroom, her fingers trembling in her lap as the judge entered. The room grew silent, every eye on the judge, waiting for the final decision. The judge cleared his throat, looking down at the papers before him. "After careful consideration of the evidence and testimony presented, we find the defendant, Obina Obena, guilty of all charges of sexual assault and abuse." Samantha's heart stopped for a moment. She had won. He was guilty. The weight that had been pressing on her chest for months finally lifted. She couldn't believe it. She had done it. Justice had been served. After the trial, Samantha stepped outside the courthouse with Susan by her side. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the city. Samantha felt exhausted, but she also felt free. She had faced her greatest fear and come out the other side stronger. She had fought for her truth, and she had won. Uncle Mark would never hurt her again, and he would never hurt anyone else. "I did it," Samantha whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Susan smiled, her eyes filled with pride. "You did, Samantha. You've taken your life back. You've fought for what's right." Samantha looked up at the sky, a sense of peace washing over her. She knew that her journey wasn't over, that the healing would take time, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was in control of her own story. And that was enough. Samantha spent most of her time with Susan, who continued to be her anchor through the storm. They took walks through the busy streets of Lagos, visited cafes, and spent hours talking about anything and everything that wasn't related to her trauma. Samantha needed this. She needed to reconnect with life outside of the courtroom, to remember that there was more to her than the pain of the past. But even as she found moments of peace, the weight of everything she had endured continued to press on her. The nightmares didn't stop. The flashbacks came when she least expected them. She could be walking down the street and suddenly feel the ghost of her uncle's presence behind her, his cold eyes, his manipulative voice. It was hard to escape the trauma, and she knew the healing process would take longer than she wanted to admit. One afternoon, as they sat in Susan's living room, Samantha was staring out the window, her thoughts far away. Susan noticed the far-off look in her eyes and gently set down the cup of tea she had been holding. "You're still carrying a lot, aren't you?" Susan asked quietly, her voice full of understanding. Samantha turned to face her friend, her expression conflicted. "I thought that after the trial, after the verdict, I would feel free. But it's hard to feel free when I still have nightmares, when I still hear his voice in my head." Susan nodded, her face softening. "It's normal. What you went through isn't something you just forget. It's going to take time, but you've already taken the hardest step, Samantha. You've faced your fears and you've taken your life back. I don't know how to move forward from here, Samantha said, her voice shaky. I feel like everything has changed, but I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know what comes next. Susan reached over and placed a hand on Samantha's, offering her comfort. You are still you, Samantha. You are stronger now than you've ever been, and that strength is going to help you move forward. You don't have to have all the answers right now. Just take it one day at a time. Samantha looked down at their joined hands, her heart swelling with gratitude for her friend. She didn't know how she would ever heal fully. The scars of her past were too deep, but maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to build something new from the rubble of her life. A few weeks later, Samantha made another decision. She wanted to help others who had gone through similar experiences. She started volunteering at a local women's shelter, offering support to survivors of abuse. The work wasn't easy. Every story she heard was a reminder of her own pain, but there was something cathartic about helping others who had been silenced, about giving them the same courage that Susan had given her. It wasn't the same as healing her own wounds, but it was a start. It was a way to take the darkness she had experienced and turn it into something positive. She could help others find their strength just like she had done. One day, while volunteering at the shelter, Samantha met a woman named Adiz who had recently escaped an abusive relationship. Adiz's story mirrored Samantha's in so many ways. Her abuser had been a man of influence, someone who had used his power to control her. But Adiz had found the courage to leave, just like Samantha had. Sometimes I feel like I'll never escape the shame, Adiz confessed one afternoon as they sat in the shelter's small office. I feel like I'll never be enough, like I'll always be defined by what happened to me. Samantha's heart broke as she listened to Adiz's words. She had felt the same way, lost, broken, defined by the trauma. But now, looking at Adiz, Samantha realized something. She had already started to heal, and she could help Adiz heal too. You're not defined by what happened to you, Samantha said softly, her voice filled with conviction. I know it's hard. It's hard to look in the mirror and not see the pain, but you are strong. You are more than what he did to you. Adiz looked at her, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and doubt. But how do I believe that? How do I move on? Samantha smiled gently. One step at a time, one day at a time. Healing doesn't happen overnight, but every time you choose to fight for yourself, you're healing a little more. Adiz nodded slowly, the words sinking in. And in that moment, Samantha realized that she had found her purpose. It wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about using the pain, the suffering, the survival to help others find their voice. As Samantha continued to volunteer, she began to feel a sense of peace that she hadn't felt before. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from forgetting or erasing the past. It was the kind of peace that came from accepting her journey, from knowing that she was no longer a victim, but a survivor. Her nightmares didn't stop entirely, and the scars of her past would always be a part of her, but now they didn't define her. She wasn't the frightened girl trapped in her uncle's house anymore. She was Samantha, the woman who had fought for her freedom, who had faced her fears and overcome them. And for the first time in a long time, she began to look forward to the future. It had been a year since the trial, and Samantha was standing at the doorstep of her own small apartment, a place she had finally been able to call her own. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She had worked hard for it, saved every penny, and now it was a symbol of her new beginning. Susan stood beside her, beaming with pride. I can't believe this day is here, she said, her voice full of emotion. You did it, Samantha. Samantha smiled, her heart full of gratitude. I didn't do it alone, Susan. You were with me every step of the way. Susan laughed softly. You were always the one with the strength. I just helped you find it. Samantha looked around her new apartment. The walls were bare, but she had already begun decorating, filling it with things that made her feel comfortable. Pictures of herself and Susan, small plants in the windowsill, the faint sound of music in the background. It was a sign of life, of peace. This was her home, her safe place. She had taken back control of her life. The future was still uncertain, but now she had the strength to face it, to move forward with hope. As she closed the door behind her, she whispered to herself, "I am free." The apartment Samantha now called her own was a modest space, but it was hers. The walls were still bare, but she had started filling them slowly with photographs, memories, and items that made her feel safe. There was still much to be done, but she could already feel the difference. Every piece of furniture she placed, every picture frame she hung, was an act of reclaiming her space, reclaiming her life. Susan visited often, always with a bag full of groceries or some small gift to help Samantha settle in. "I thought I'd help you start organizing a bit more," Susan said one afternoon, carrying a box of kitchen supplies. "You can't live on takeout forever, you know." Samantha laughed. The sound still felt strange to her after everything she had been through. It felt like a distant memory, a part of her life left behind with her uncle's arrest and the painful months that followed. "I'll take whatever help you can give," Samantha said with a smile. As Susan helped organize the small kitchen, Samantha found herself leaning against the counter, watching her friend work. The warmth in her heart was undeniable. Susan had been there for her through it all. Through the court case, through the long nights of doubt, through the weeks of struggle after the trial. She had become more than a friend. She was family. "You've really done it, you know," Susan said, placing the last of the dishes in the cupboard. "You've built something beautiful from all the pain." Samantha looked around the apartment, finally feeling the sense of peace she had been searching for. She had made it. She had survived. The thought still seemed surreal, but she no longer felt the same fear and uncertainty that had once plagued her every step. "I never thought I'd be able to get here," Samantha said quietly. "But here I am, I'm free." Susan smiled softly, giving her a long, meaningful look. "You are always strong, Samantha. You just had to believe it." The words hung in the air, and Samantha felt a rush of emotion. She had been through so much to get here. The trauma, the fear, the moments of helplessness. It had all been a part of her journey, but it didn't define her anymore. She had taken back her voice, her power. As much as Samantha tried to focus on the present, there were moments when the past crept back into her thoughts. The nightmares were less frequent, but they still came. Sometimes she woke up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, her body trembling from the vivid images of Uncle Mark's cold, predatory gaze. She would sit on the edge of her bed, trying to steady her breath, reminding herself that she was no longer trapped. But the trauma wasn't something that disappeared with a victory in court. It lingered like a shadow that followed her no matter how far she ran. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, Samantha found herself sitting alone on her balcony, staring out at the city skyline. The world felt distant, as if she were watching it through a fog. She had come so far, yet the weight of her past still felt heavy on her shoulders. Susan appeared quietly beside her, holding 2 cups of tea. She sat down beside Samantha, offering her one of the cups. "You know, you don't always have to carry this by yourself," Susan said gently, her eyes soft with understanding. "You don't have to be the strong one all the time." Samantha looked down at her cup, swirling the tea slowly. "I don't know how to let go of it, Susan. The memories, they still haunt me. I don't know if I'll ever really be free of them." Susan gave her a thoughtful look, taking a sip from her own cup. "You might never fully forget what happened to you, Samantha, but you can choose how to let it shape your future. It doesn't have to define you. You're still here, you're still standing, and that's what matters." Samantha stared at her friend, the weight of her words sinking in. It was true. The past had been painful, but it had also taught her lessons she would carry with her for the rest of her life. She couldn't erase what had happened, but she could choose to let it be a part of her story without letting it control her. "I just wish I could feel at peace with it," Samantha said quietly. "You will. Susan replied, her voice firm with reassurance. "But peace doesn't happen overnight. It's a journey, one that you're already on. You're going to get there, Samantha. Just keep going." Samantha took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her friend's words sink into her bones. She wasn't alone in this. She didn't have to carry it all by herself. There were people who cared for her, people who believed in her, and that meant something. As Samantha settled into her new life, she found herself drawn more and more to the idea of helping others. The women she met at the shelter had touched her deeply, and she realized that she had something valuable to offer. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a mentor, a guide. With Susan's encouragement, Samantha started taking steps toward turning her experiences into something meaningful. She enrolled in courses on social work and advocacy, hoping to make a difference in the lives of other women who had gone through similar pain. The journey wasn't easy, and it was one Samantha hadn't expected to take, but it felt right. It gave her purpose. One evening, as she and Susan sat in her apartment working on a proposal for a new outreach program at the shelter, Samantha turned to her friend, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I never thought I'd be here, Susan," she said. "I never thought I could help anyone after everything that happened." Susan looked up from the papers they were reviewing, her eyes filled with pride. "You've always had the heart to help others, Samantha. It was just buried under everything you went through. Now you're using your pain to fuel something good." Samantha's smile grew, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Months passed, and Samantha's life slowly began to take shape again. She had built a foundation of healing, and with each passing day, she was more and more confident in her ability to stand on her own 2 feet. There were still difficult moments, days when the weight of the past felt heavy, but those moments became fewer and farther apart. One day she received a letter from the police station. It was a notice about her uncle's upcoming sentencing. The trial had concluded, but now it was time for the final verdict. Samantha had known this would come, but as she read through the details, a strange sense of closure washed over her. She didn't know if it would ever fully heal her, but the thought that he would finally face justice made the years of pain feel like they were coming to an end. She held the letter in her hands, feeling a sense of finality. Uncle Mark would be punished for what he had done, and while that didn't erase the past, it was a powerful step in her own journey of healing. The letter was a reminder of how far she had come, how much she had fought to reclaim her life, her voice. She had gone from being a victim, silent and afraid, to a survivor, strong and resilient. And she would continue to walk this path, one step at a time, embracing the future she was building. With a deep breath, Samantha folded the letter and placed it in her drawer. The past was behind her. The future was hers to shape. Samantha had come a long way. The nightmares had lessened in frequency, though they still haunted her occasionally, especially on particularly quiet nights when her thoughts wandered too far back into the dark corners of her mind. But now, the bright light of her future was clearer. Even when the shadows of her past tried to creep in, she had found purpose in her work with the women's shelter. Her role had evolved from being a volunteer to a mentor, helping others navigate their own journeys of recovery. She had created support groups, provided resources, and led workshops on how to rebuild after trauma. It felt fulfilling, like each woman's success was a small victory for her own healing. But even with all the good she was doing, there were days when it felt like the weight of the world was on her shoulders. Helping others meant reliving her own pain, each story reminding her of her own struggles. But in a strange way, it helped her by guiding others towards strength. She was slowly learning how to strengthen herself. One Friday evening, as she closed up the shelter after a long day of meetings, Samantha was exhausted. She walked to the bus stop, her mind replaying everything that had happened over the past few years. As the bus approached, she felt the familiar sense of peace that had been building inside her. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers, her life, her choices, her future. She climbed aboard the bus, her mind drifting toward the new project she was working on for the shelter. It was a community outreach program aimed at educating young girls about healthy relationships and the signs of manipulation and abuse. The more she thought about it, the more it felt like she was doing the work that was meant for her. She was reaching out to others before they ended up in the same position she had been in, helpless and trapped. As she sat down in her seat, her phone buzzed in her bag. She pulled it out to see a message from Susan. "Are you free tonight? I've been thinking we should go out for dinner. You deserve a night off." Samantha smiled at the message. She hadn't had much time for herself recently, and Susan was right. She needed a break. With all the emotional work she had been doing, a bit of fun, a little relaxation was just what she needed. "That sounds perfect. I'll meet you at 7, Samantha replied. She was looking forward to a relaxing evening, simply being with her best friend, talking about life and not about trauma, not about healing. It was time to connect with herself outside of her work and her past. Later that evening, Samantha met Susan at a small, quiet restaurant near the city center. It was a cozy, intimate place, just the right atmosphere for a night of unwinding. The table was set for 2, candles flickering gently in the middle. As they sat down, Susan smiled at her. "How's everything going? The shelter? The new project?" she asked, her eyes filled with interest and warmth. Samantha took a deep breath, her smile wide as she spoke. "It's going great. We've got a lot of support, and the young women are so eager to learn. I think we can make a real difference. I'm also working on a few initiatives for survivors of abuse who want to start over, get back into school or work." "That's amazing," Susan said, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "You're doing so much for other people, Samantha. You're changing lives." Samantha looked at her friend, a sense of deep gratitude filling her. "I never thought I'd be in this position when I was living with my uncle. I didn't think I could ever make something good out of all of this, but now it feels like everything has a purpose." "I'm proud of you," Susan said, her voice full of sincerity. "You've come so far, and look at everything you're doing. You're making a difference. You're healing, too, even if you don't always see it." Samantha smiled, feeling the weight of Susan's words. Sometimes it was hard to see it. There were times when she felt overwhelmed, like the past was still there, waiting to take over. But Susan was right. She had learned to live again, not just to exist, but to find meaning, to find joy in the small moments. And the more she helped others, the more she helped herself. Exercise. They spent the evening talking about everything and nothing, sharing laughs, stories, and even some dreams about the future. For the first time in a long time, Samantha felt light, like the weight of everything she had endured wasn't crushing her. She had finally found her way forward. As Samantha continued to rebuild her life, new relationships blossomed. She met Emeka, a man who worked in community outreach during one of the shelter events. He was kind, thoughtful, and incredibly patient. At first, Samantha wasn't sure if she was ready for a relationship. She had spent so much time focusing on her healing. She wasn't sure if she could open herself up to someone new. But Emeka was different. He didn't push her. He took his time to get to know her, listening to her story, understanding the scars she still carried. He never rushed her. They started spending more time together. Coffee dates, long walks, and evenings discussing their shared passion for helping others. Slowly, Samantha began to realize that she could open her heart again. One evening, as they walked through a park, Emeka stopped and turned to her. "Samantha, I know you've been through a lot," he said, his voice gentle. "But I want you to know that I'm here for you. No matter what, you don't have to carry this alone anymore." Tears welled up in Samantha's eyes. She had never expected to feel this way again. Open, loved, and accepted. It had taken so much time, so much healing, but now she felt ready. She felt like she could finally take a step into the future, not alone, but with someone who saw her as more than her pain. "I don't know what the future holds," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "but I'm willing to try. I'm willing to see what comes next." Emeka smiled, his eyes filled with warmth. "We'll take it one day at a time," he said softly. "Together." Months passed, and Samantha continued to grow in ways she had never imagined. She still had her moments of doubt, her days when the weight of the past seemed too much to bear, but she had learned to take it day by day. She had learned to celebrate the small victories, the moments of peace. Her work with the shelter flourished, and she began mentoring other women who had dreams of opening businesses or continuing their education. She knew what it was like to start over, and she knew that every woman she helped was taking back something precious: her dignity, her strength, her future. And through it all, Emeka remained by her side. Slowly they built something beautiful together. Something built on mutual respect, understanding, and love. As Samantha sat in her apartment one evening, looking out at the city lights, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for everything she had accomplished. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into that courtroom years ago, trembling with fear. She was a woman who had faced the worst and had come out stronger on the other side. The future was still uncertain, but Samantha now knew one thing for sure. No matter what came next, she would face it with strength, with courage, and with the unwavering belief that she was worthy of love, peace, and happiness. And so Samantha walked forward into her future, not defined by her past, but empowered by it.